not know about the revolving fund, it's a $500 million business, a mechanism for purchasing vaccines on behalf of countries of the Americas. It uses a pooled procurement strategies, benefiting from economies of scale to negotiate more affordable prices. Really speaks to the genius of Dr. Ciro de Quadros, who started it back in 1979. John will be speaking on the supply and demand of currently available flu vaccines. We've been told some people have had some speaker problems, so that's why I'm speaking very loud. Some of you may hear me loud and clear, others apparently are not hearing as clearly, so I'm trying to speak as loud as possible. I'll stop here and turn the microphone over to Dr. Martin Friede, who is presenting from Geneva. Martin, thanks again for all the support you've provided this meeting. We look forward to your presentation.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay, John, do you see my screen? Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So John, thanks for asking me to talk here. First of all, I think to all of you, my apologies. This is a crazy time. I don't need to tell you why it's a crazy time. And I really pulled this together when John asked me to, and then I kind of looked at it again this morning and I added this thing, a few words on COVID-19. I hope this is what you're looking for. If it's not, you can ask me to talk again later on in the day. We are going into lockdown in about 3 hours time. So as soon as I finish this talk, I have to quickly run to some shops and buy some food because there'll be nothing available for the next couple of days. Okay, let's just get into this. I'm going to move the pictures of you guys off into the corner. So I'm sure I'm not teaching you anything here, but this is the seasonal flu vaccine effectiveness in the USA. We're using USA data here. And this covers 2004 through to the 2017 period. And what you can see here is that some years it's kind of okay, 60%, and some years it's really bad, down at the 15%. And this is what we tell the population. And when we tell the population, people, this year the flu vaccine is 15% efficacious. Well, the next year they say, I'm not going to go and get that. I mean, a 15% efficacious vaccine. So one of the first problems that we are facing is that we've got variability, and what people remember are the years of low efficacy. Now, the second problem is here in the next slide, which is the effectiveness across different age groups. I'm sure you all know this. Reasonably effective, 6 to 17 years. This is the 2012-2013 year season. 17 to 49 years, pretty good. 50 to 64 years, pretty good. And then suddenly, when we look at the older age group, the older 65s, which is where we've got the highest burden of severe disease and mortality, this is where the efficacy drops off. So when we go into people and saying, you are old, you should be getting the flu vaccine, and they say, well, the flu vaccine doesn't work in old people, we have a communication problem. And then this also impacts then the way we communicate with governments, because governments are saying, we are procuring the vaccine for old people, but it doesn't work in old people, and we don't need to give it to the younger people because they are not the ones that are going to hospital. And so we are finishing up with a dichotomy between what we are recommending, which is where the vaccine is needed the most, and the efficacy in that age group. So what is happening in terms of the pipeline? And I just want to show you here what the relatively new, something relatively new, which is the use of a high dose influenza vaccine. Now, could be a lot of you know about this, but what is relatively new is that we now have very good and consistent evidence that the high dose vaccine is really better in old people. Now, this is a bit of a problem because already the vaccine, the standard dose vaccine, is already 15 micrograms of each strain. There's either going to be 45 or 60 micrograms in total. When we get to this high dose, it is 60 micrograms of each strain, that might mean up to 240 micrograms of protein. So this is now giving us a number of problems. The first one is the cost. So the cost of making a high-dose vaccine, the cost of goods, is going to be 4 times the price of the cost of goods of a standard dose vaccine. And therefore, the lowest that the company can sell it for is going to be 4 times the price of the standard dose vaccine. And what we're seeing is they're selling it at a lot more than 4 times higher. But the question is the efficacy 4 times higher? No. We are going from an efficacy of, let's say, 40% on average for the older people to an efficacy of 50, 55%. Now, that is statistically significant, from 40 to 55. But does that increase in efficacy justify paying 4 or maybe even 8-fold higher? Now, the problem in many of the, we talk to PAHO, so let's consider the PAHO countries. For many of them, they are relatively resource constrained. They have decided to implement influenza vaccine, but there is a fixed budget. Now, let's say that fixed budget could procure 1 million doses of standard strain. Well, this could only procure 250,000 doses at best of the high dose vaccine. What is better? Is it better to immunize 1 million people with a vaccine of 40% efficacy, or a quarter of that number, 250,000, with a vaccine of 60% efficacy? So this vaccine is there, and in Europe, Canada, USA, there is a general policy decision to move towards these vaccines. But I think the PAHO countries really need to be considering what is the cost effectiveness, given that there is a marginal increase in efficacy, but a non-marginal, very significant increase in efficacy. Now let's move to the next slide. So other groups, to address the low immunogenicity in the elderly, have added the adjuvant. The adjuvant typically is the MF59 oil and water adjuvant. Now this has only been available up to 1 company, but partially because of COVID and partially because of the scare we got with H1N1, now many groups are developing these oil and water emulsions. So any of the manufacturers these days should be able to access such adjuvants. Now, what we can see here is the adjuvanted vaccine is more effective. The efficacy is increased compared to the standard vaccine in the older population. But I am not going to go so far as to say that it is as good as the high dose. I have not yet seen, several groups are working on a systematic review to compare adjuvant with high dose. Adjuvant is better than standard dose, but it could be that high dose is better than adjuvant. Let's just leave it like that. So this gives us 2 products that are available for the older population, which give increased efficacy of the vaccine. And if your national policy is for old people, this could be good, but we need to be looking at the cost effectiveness of using it. Now, also there's this movement, and this is very interesting data from 2011, the Vesikari paper, where he took the adjuvanted vaccine and he immunized very young children with it. Now, you all know that giving the standard influenza injectable vaccine to young children is not all that efficacious, especially in the 6 to 12-month age group. There you have to give at least 2 doses. And as we can see here, you can't see my screen and you can't see my finger. In the 6 to 11-month age group, the second dose, that's day 50 dose, you're still getting a very poor response without adjuvant, but you're getting a very good response with adjuvant. So in this very young age group, the adjuvant is having a huge and beneficial effect. And then when we go to the graph on the right, this is showing how this translates to efficacy between the trivalent inactivated vaccine in blue and the adjuvanted trivalent inactivated vaccine in yellowish pink. And here we can see this is really having a huge impact on efficacy. So the question then is, why are we not using these adjuvanted vaccines in this young age group? Adjuvants are fantastic at priming an immune response, and influenza vaccination is normally boosting, except in this young age group where we are priming. So we were very pleased to see that Canada has now licensed the adjuvanted flu vaccine for children, but they are only using it down to the age of 8 years old. And there's no point using it in 8-year-old because 8-year-olds have already seen the influenza vaccine or the influenza virus. So, and what we're seeing in Canada is no benefit. So we need to be bringing this type of vaccine down into the very young age group. Let's move on to the next slide. So then live attenuated vaccines. Now the US uses or used a lot of the live attenuated backbone. Just very quickly, on Earth, there are two types of influenza, live attenuated influenza. There is the one using the Ann Arbor backbone, which is made by MedImmune AstraZeneca. And there's one using the Leningrad backbone, which is made by the Russians, and WHO has now transferred this technology to India, Thailand, and China, and it is approved in India, Thailand, and China. Now, this was a recommended, in the USA, your ACIP had recommended using the live attenuated vaccine over the inactivated vaccine. Unfortunately, only from 2 years on, because they'd seen a little bit of wheezing and some adverse events below the age of 2. However, some years ago, something happened. Let's quickly look at what happened. So it used to work extremely well. So historically, the live attenuated vaccines had a very, very good efficacy. Let's go into what happened. And we look at the 2011 to 12 period, 2012 to 13 period, 2000 to 13-14 period. And we can see that what happened in 2013-14 is suddenly the efficacy in the very young children dropped off really drastically from 50 to 60% down to a negative 30% efficacy or effectiveness. Whereas in the older population, this was not seen so much, and we can look at why. So when we now look at within that was a trivalent vaccine, what was going on? Here we can see it contained 3 components. It was the H1N1, this was post-2009 pandemic, H3N2 and B, and here we compare the efficacy seen in the live vaccine and the inactivated vaccine. And we can see that it was the live vaccine that was driving this drop in efficacy. The inactivated vaccine was working really well, okay? So what had caused this sudden drop of the LAIV efficacy, specifically with the H1N1 strain, still reasonably efficacious H3N2 and B. And here we can look across a whole range of study sites that were measuring the effectiveness of the LAIV versus IIV. And what you can see really striking here in the second column from the left is that in the CDC VE network, we see that the LAIV became drastically reduced that year. The US Department of Defense was also pretty low, but in other countries, for example, Canada was a bit higher, Finland was reasonably high, but in all of them, the LAIV that year was lower. Now, that was looking at the H1N1 strain. I just wanted to bring up also what happens when we look at the B strain, because the B strain also sometimes gives something surprising. And here we can see that in Finland that year, the inactivated vaccine was giving very low efficacy for the B strain. You know, each time we look at influenza data, I realize we don't know a lot about influenza. It's also very difficult when we're dealing with different manufacturers, different types of vaccines. So what resulted from this was that countries said, oh, live attenuated vaccines don't work, stop using them. And that's a pity because it's a very good vaccine, especially for young children. So we, with the manufacturers, we tried to look at what was going wrong and could we fix it. And here, very interesting, we can see that the live attenuated vaccines that were developed before the H1N1 pandemic bound very well to nasal epithelial cells. But after the pandemic, the H1N1 didn't bind very well to the nasal epithelia. And therefore, what could have been happening, and we think this is the case, was that the H3 strains and the B strains were essentially outcompeting a rather badly designed H1N1. We can go into this in more detail if you want, but I'm really going to come to where are we now. So now the manufacturers have included a new quality control assay as they select the candidate vaccine virus to make the live attenuated influenza vaccines. And this means that the selection of the candidate vaccine virus now takes into account the nasal epithelial binding and the rate of replication on tissue culture. And we think that this is now being solved. So we now have 2 years in a row where the live attenuated influenza vaccine is once again efficacious H1N1, H3N2, and B strains, be it 1B strain or 2B strains. However, the damage has been done, and we have seen a significant reduction in the interest of countries in live attenuated vaccines. We think this is a great pity because live attenuated vaccines give us the opportunity of inducing a really good both cellular and antibody response to the virus. And it is possible that if we could get this done very early in life, before children received a single strain infection, it might set up the immune system to respond better in the future. Now, the other thing that's happening is that people have begun to notice that although we grow 90% of the vaccines come from eggs, when they're grown in tissue culture, the efficacy is slightly higher. This is not always the case, but generally the case over the last several years. And so there's a push now to produce these vaccines on tissue culture. But the problem is, especially in the middle income countries, Brazil, Argentina, currently using eggs, especially Brazil, to transition to tissue culture would be a fantastically enormous investment. And so it is, we don't need to look at that. It is worrying when we see then the USA giving this executive order to modernize influenza vaccines to not be reliant on eggs. But this is also good because now with COVID, we are seeing the need to be able to ramp up. And we have seen that with eggs, you cannot ramp up because you have to order your eggs 1 year in advance. So it is good that we move away from eggs, but more towards a recombinant vaccine. Now, another issue that's coming up is, can repeated annual vaccination result in reduced efficacy? Why, which strains, when, and what can we do about it? So there is evidence coming from several groups that when you get the vaccine every single year, the efficacy is lower than if you didn't get the vaccine last year and you got the vaccine this year. This is, of course, of great concern to those of us who make policy, because how on earth could we make a policy which says, well, normally you get the vaccine every 3 years, but sometimes we'll tell you to get it every 2 years or maybe every year. That will not work. So we're trying to understand how important this is, and I'll get to what we're doing about that in a moment. So these are the questions which WHO is looking at, TIV versus QIV. The big problem is that there are fewer and fewer producers of pre-qualified trivalent influenza vaccine. Unfortunately, there's a lot of the manufacturers only have quadrivalent vaccine available, and this costs more than trivalent. So this is a problem. High dose versus standard dose. Standard dose is not very effective for the older groups. Adjuvanted versus standard, egg versus tissue culture, IIV versus LAIV. And the policymakers are going to need to be considering all of these. Which vaccines do they buy? What is the cost effectiveness and what is the efficacy? So we will be reviewing this at the SAGE Influenza Working Group in December 2020, and we will give you an update early January. So these are the problems with our flu vaccines: poor moderate efficacy, mismatch, annual need, it's cost of programmatic unsuitability. We've got this hemisphere issue, need for strain matching, speed of production, cross protection, efficacy, duration, cost, and supply. So we're looking in the pipeline towards better vaccines with cross protection, better speed of response, and ideally better duration of response. But so far, no immunologist that I've met knows how to actively induce bone marrow derived plasmacytes, which are required for long lasting immunity. So just a snapshot of what's coming down the line. We've got virus vectored vaccines, for example, based on MVA. We've got novel adjuvants, for example, mucosal adjuvants. We've got nanoparticle vaccines, which I'll touch on for a second. This is from, for example, the Novavax vaccine. We've got nucleic acid vaccines. These are really important, especially the RNA. Cell-based virus vaccines. We've got alternative delivery. We can put vaccines on a patch, which you put on the arm, sublingual vaccines. We've got vaccines that are based not on the whole hemagglutinin, just on part of the hemagglutinin, or vaccines based on T-cell. Now, it used to be that this slide, people would say, yeah. Suddenly, in the last few weeks, this is what has happened. And that all of these technologies are being used in COVID. So while COVID is creating a complete mess for our lives, COVID is also, I believe, building the opportunity for us to now actually get our hands on technologies for better influenza vaccines. So just very quickly, I'll talk for a moment about the STEM universal vaccines. But what we've got here in red, this is something which Novavax is in late stage, they're in phase 3. This is a nanoparticle with a saponin adjuvant. And the data is looking very good. So this is a new type of vaccine that's coming on top of the ones that I've spoken about. And so I think is going to be approved fairly soon. And then we will see I'll talk to universal vaccines. I just briefly want to mention the mRNA vaccines. So just here, the nucleic acid vaccines. This is one of the lead vaccines for COVID. And once this technology becomes established, which will be in the next months, not years, this could really change the way we think about making influenza vaccines. I'm just going to quickly walk through some slides. This is from the NIH. This is the NIAID approach to make universal influenza vaccines. This is from Barney Graham, who's an advisor to WHO. And really, I'm just going to dive to this slide here, where you can see that so what this does, it is taking the parts of the hemagglutinin and putting the parts that are highly conserved into these nanoparticular structures, but very importantly, by putting more than one hemagglutinin onto each particle, we are avoiding the problem of immunodominance and the response being too focused. So this is giving us an immune response, which is targeting the conserved region on the hemagglutinin. And this is able to, in this slide, you can see it is able to provide protection in an animal model. Now, it's going to take us years to get this to an approved product. I'm just going to clip to a few things and talk about this activity of the development of a universal influenza roadmap being run by CIDRAP with Wellcome Trust, which is where are we, where do we want to get to, and what do we need to get there? And one of the problems with universal is, what do we mean by universal? Is it to protect all infection against all strains for life, or just against severe infection for 10 years, or drifted strains for 5 years, or all strains for 6 months? And so we need the definition of what are we trying to achieve, because depends on what you're trying to achieve, your probability of getting there changes. And this brings in a whole range of things. Is this for seasonal, for pandemic? What are the corridors of protection? What are we trying to achieve? How to make this sustainable? So that roadmap run by CIDRAP with Wellcome Trust is making big progress now in establishing this roadmap. I think several of you are participating in that. WHO, we came up with the preferred product characteristics, and it said that by 2022, we want greater protection than that provided by current vaccines. Well, 2022 is next year. So unfortunately, I think we're not going to get there. and that by 2027, we wanted vaccines that provide protection against severe influenza virus for at least 5 years. So this would be a vaccine that could be stockpiled. So given how the roadmap is progressing, I think we now need to revisit these preferred product characteristics. The challenge to getting there is how we're going to do efficacy trials, what are the pathways, and who's going to pay for this. So I'm going to just finish my last minute or two, a few words about COVID. I'm not going to go through the pipeline because that would take another half hour. But I just want to emphasize, so the first issue we've had to deal with is how do we use seasonal influenza vaccines during the COVID-19 pandemic? And SAGE, which is the advisory group, has issued guidance on this. So we used to say, and we normally say, pregnant women is the most important, and then elderly. Because of COVID, we've now said healthcare workers and the elderly are the most important targets during the COVID pandemic. We want to keep healthcare workers at work, and we want to keep the elderly people out of the healthcare centers, because if they go to healthcare centers, they're probably not going to come out. What we're also learning is the COVID vaccine development timelines have shown us we can do vaccine development in 12 months, from having a sequence to approval and supply. So how will this impact influenza vaccine manufacturing timelines? I've already said this. The mRNA, or some technologies, I like the mRNA, it's my personal view. When the capacity to produce this is in multiple countries, this will enable, first of all, a rapid response to a pandemic. So if we had flu vaccines based on mRNA, we would be able to respond within weeks, not within the year that it took us with H1N1. Rapid seasonal response, we would not have to have our strain selection in February. We could maybe have our strain selection in July or August. And we could incorporate both the neuraminidase, the nuclear protein, and because of the cell-mediated immunity, expand the breadth. We will have enhanced adjuvant supply. I've spoken about that. Now there's the issue of viral vectors, for example, chimp adeno, Ad5. I don't know if these are applicable to seasonal vaccines because they would need to be given every year, and anti-vector immunity may play a role. So my conclusion is this: we are not in a good place yet, but it's a better place than where we were even 1 year ago. So I think there's a silver lining in the cloud of COVID. And I really think that when we talk this time next year, we'll be in a much better place. Thank you.
Martin, that was excellent. You covered a lot of ground very clearly, covering a lot of issues. It was an excellent presentation in the time allotted. I will open up just for a minute or two for questions, key questions. Olivia, do you see anything in the chat that I should? I don't see anything at the moment. Well, let's go ahead then and move on to our next speaker, Dr. Morens. Thanks again. I want to put out a shout out to David, because he's been engaged with the planning of this meeting since the get-go. I appreciate all the support you've provided and guidance. Thanks, David. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you, John. I want to tell everybody we've been having some technical issues, so I'm not sure how this is going to work. And I've asked Olivia I can barely hear anybody, so I've asked Olivia to scream at me if there's anything we need to do. Let's try to see if I can get this set up. Are you seeing my slides, everybody? It's okay, okay.
Looks great.
All right, so let me go ahead and again, if there's a technical issue that I don't appreciate, let me know. So when John and Steve asked me to give this talk on the subject of advances in vaccine development for influenza-related secondary bacterial infections, I said to John, well, it's going to be a very short talk. I'll probably have one slide, and the one slide will be no progress. Thank you. Any questions? But I'm going to try to make this into a 25 or so minute talk anyways. Now my slides aren't moving. Okay, here we go. Start by talking a little bit about the history of influenza to make the point that bacterial pneumonias complicating influenza have probably been around for a very long time. We have reasonably well documented influenza pandemics going back to 1510 and more or less okay documented pandemics going back as far as the year 876 AD. And in fact, for the last several hundred years, there's been documentation of complications of what historically seems to be influenza by what appear to be bacterial pneumonias. Of course, we didn't know about viruses and bacterial pneumonia back then, but by reading autopsy and other medical reports, it seems pretty clear that bacterial infection complicating influenza has been around for a very long time. It's still around, and it's likely to be around as long as we have influenza. I'm going to talk a lot about the 1918 influenza because it's the classical example of a pandemic of influenza in which bacterial complications were determinant. And here I'm just going to remind you of the horrible events of 1918 in which an estimated 50 million or more people died of influenza, and we believe most of those, as I'll say in a minute, most of those people died of bacterial pneumonia as a complication. I always show slides like this just because I want to remind people of the terrible human tragedy. It's one of the reasons we're all here, to prevent things like this from happening again. So it's worth just thinking about the fact that this is not a scientific subject, but a human existential subject. So it was never a secret. It was known in 1918 and 1919, but we forgot it and we had to rediscover it, that almost everybody who died in 1918, and some people still refuse to believe this, but having myself looked at over 8,000 autopsies from 1918, I can tell you, and these are autopsies in which not only were the tissues looked at in gross and microscopic sections, but also bacterial cultures were taken, that almost everybody who died of influenza in 1918 died with, and very likely because, of bacterial pneumonia. And for those who may doubt this, we can talk about it later. The predominant bacteria in 1918 were pneumococcus and streptococcus, to a lesser extent Staph aureus and some other bacteria. It's interesting that even meningococcus pneumonia was seen. Meningococcus, which we think of as causing meningococcal meningitis, caused meningococcal pneumonia. Basically, any bad tissue damaging bug that could be carried in the nose and throat got down into the lungs in 1918 and was responsible for deaths. Now, I'm going to apologize to those of you who are not pathologists or biomedical people and don't read slides. I'm going to show you a bunch of images that might look like Rorschach patterns or something, but I just want to show you what this looks like. This is 1918 pneumonia with respiratory tract damage everywhere. It's a bronchopneumonia, which is different from the typical pneumonia we think of is a lobar pneumonia. It occurs in one part of the lung, a lobe or two lobes or a lobule, but it's focal. It occurs either from aspiration or from bacteremia. But this is different. The type of pneumonia seen in 1918 was bronchopneumonia. It had millions of different foci that spread outwards from the respiratory tree into the surrounding tissue. And here you see what I think I will call just really bad red stuff. This is hematoxylin and eosin stain of lungs. And I think even people who aren't used to reading these things can see that things don't look very good. In the southeast corner, you're looking at alveoli, the air sacs that are filled with edema fluid. That pink stuff is essentially fluid. These parts of the lungs were drowning, and people were drowning, and that's why we had the terrible clinical symptoms that were seen in 1918. Here we see, if we look over on the right, we see two boxes showing the tissues in 1918 on the top box, and the H1N1, 2009 H1N1 virus on the bottom box. And you can see that 1918 is filled with all these things that look like grape shot, which are mostly neutrophils, and the walls are thickened and damaged. So comparing 1918 pneumonia complicated with bacteria to the common pneumonia seen in 2009, it's a different thing. And these things that look like fancy rugs on the left are heat maps showing the genetic responses to these things, including the inflammatory response, including interferon and cell stress responses and other things that I will talk about in a minute, just to get you familiar to this stuff. And the way these heat maps are read is green means the genes are turned on, red means the genes are not turned on. So here again, we see a 1918 autopsy with all the different bugs I mentioned: strep pneumoniae, pneumococcus in the northwest, strep pyogenes, group A beta hemolytic strep in the northeast, strep pneumoniae again in the southwest, and staphylococcus in the lower right-hand corner. And I want to say again that these were the predominant bugs in 1918. Bacterial pneumonias still occur today, but the predominant bug now is staphylococcus, and the others are predominant to a lesser extent, and there are many others that are also involved, including particularly people who've been on ventilators, who've been in ICU for a long time. We didn't have ventilators in 1918, but people who end up dying after a long course in the ICU on a ventilator may have a lot more likely to have gram-negative organisms. These people will be on antibiotics in almost all cases. So as I mentioned, in 1918, the vast majority of deaths were due to bacterial co-infections, superinfections, over 95%. It appears from studies done on autopsies in 1957 and 1968 that the percentage is lower, probably 30 to 75%. But this is in the antibiotic era. So as I mentioned yesterday, I think that it's very hard to say definitively what the percentage of bacterial co-infection is, because nowadays, and even back as far as 1957, but certainly now, people who present to the hospital with pneumonia that requires them to be hospitalized have almost 100% been on antibiotics. And if they haven't been, they get put on intravenous antibiotics immediately. And the interval between presentation to the hospital and time of death is many days or weeks. And after having been on antibiotics for weeks, if you die and have an autopsy, you're not going to find bacteria. But that doesn't mean the bacterial damage hasn't already occurred. I also want to say that there were vaccines in 1918, and these were bacterial vaccines. They were essentially inactivated bacteria in various combinations used in the developed world, in the United States and Canada. All over Europe, these vaccines were used, and they often contained Haemophilus influenzae. They almost always contained pneumococcus, and they sometimes contained other things like streptococcus, and there's a whole literature on this. But a few years ago, Dr. Chen, who's now back in China, did this. It's kind of a meta-analysis study of vaccine studies, vaccine trials that were done in 1918, 1919. And of course, these were not trials that were controlled in the way we would do it today. And so you can complain about them, but basically these several studies, civilian studies and military studies, virtually all, with one exception, showed that these vaccines that were given in 1918, when compared to people who didn't get the vaccines, and supposedly these were, if not individually matched, at least were similar groups of people, were efficacious and prevented a certain amount of death. Now, what's the mechanism of this copathogenesis? Well, we don't really know. There's a huge literature on this. This is a 9-year-old slide that reviewed, at that time, 252 scientific published papers on the causes of bacterial and viral copathogenesis in influenza. And I just basically show this to show there's a whole bunch of things going on. But I also want to make the point that when I looked at these autopsies, these 8,000 autopsies, many of them included autopsies of the upper respiratory tract. I never saw a single case in which there was influenza pneumonia without having severe tracheitis in those autopsies that documented tracheitis or lack of it. And I think that, you know, putting all the pieces together, what this suggests to me is that the first step in bacterial pneumonia with flu is viral cytopathic damage to the cells. Basically, it's like a lawnmower going down your respiratory tract from your nose and mouth all the way down to your alveoli, ripping off the one cell layer of epithelium. And that one cell layer of epithelium contains the goblet cells, the cilia, and all the things that keep bacteria out of our lungs. And once they're gone, the bacteria in your nose are down in your alveoli within at most 1 to 2 days. So here again, we're going to look at some pictures, and I don't think you can't see my pointer, can you? Or can you?
Yes.
You can see it?
Yeah.
Yes, we see it.
We can see it. All right, so here we have the 2009 virus. And you can see there's a layer of epithelium. This is inside a bronchiole. These are epithelial cells, these lining cells, cuboidal or columnar. As they go higher up, they're columnar, become cuboidal as they go down. But then this is an experimental study in mice, and you can do this in mice, ferrets, or whatever. We can't do this to people, but we infect them either with the 2009 virus or the 2009 virus plus Streptococcus pyogenes. I'm sorry, this is strep pneumoniae, this is pneumococcus. And what you see is the virus itself doesn't do much damage to the epithelium, and when it does, it repairs really quickly. And this is something to know about influenza and why it's so unlikely that you'll die of purely viral influenza viral pneumonia, because once the epithelium is wiped out by the virus, it repairs substantially within 4 days. So even in 1918, even in people who had died, virtually every single person had evidence of substantial repair of the epithelium that had been damaged by virus. But on the other hand, when you add a bacterium, pneumococcus, you can see the whole epithelium is gone. Not only the epithelium, but the basal cells that are kind of like stem cells that regenerate the epithelium. This is one of the reasons I think we die of bacterial pneumonia with flu, because the cells that would regenerate the epithelium are gone. They've been damaged by the bacteria. Here we see something similar. This is staining for viral antigen. And you can see here, if you can see my pointer, that this is just the H1N1 2009 virus alone. And you can see there's all sorts of virus in the epithelial cells, and they're going to be damaged and killed, but these basal cells are going to grow right back out and replace them. When you take the same study and take the 2009 H1N1 virus and add pneumococcus, you can see that even the basal cells are gone. So, you know, this is the 1-2 punch of viruses and bacteria. This is just a paper I'm going to show some images from in a minute. I want to credit the authors, Kathy Walters and John Cash, and some of my colleagues at NIH. So what happens in 1918 influenza with or without bacterial complication? The 1918 influenza was different than any other influenza we've had in the modern era, because it did some really weird things that influenza normally doesn't do. We see activation of neutrophils, white blood cells, and elastase deposition. Elastase is an enzyme that chews up proteins. And here we see neutrophil elastase in staining for neutrophil elastase. This stuff is really damaging, and it basically destroys cells. Also, there is activation of platelets and the extrinsic coagulation pathway. This happens naturally in 1918 viral infection. It doesn't happen with modern influenza viruses, or at least not to a great degree. So 1918 was different. And here we have, you can see, I think, if you see the staining here for neutrophils, this is the 1918 virus alone, and this is the 1918 virus with pneumococcus, and this is pneumococcus alone. And you can see that the virus and the bacterium together cause all this dark staining stuff is neutrophil-specific staining. I'm going to skip this slide because it's a little too complicated. This is Virchow's triad. Virchow's triad was described by Virchow in, forgetting the year, but it was a long, back in the 1800s. Virchow's triad is damage to the veins, blood coagulation, and venous stasis, resulting in microclots. And this is what you see in 1918 influenza. Now, why am I harping on 1918 influenza? Well, it's gone. Maybe we shouldn't worry about it. But I would argue that we should, because one of the things we've learned in recent years is that the reason all this bad stuff happened in 1918 is because 1918 came with a hemagglutinin called an H1. There are 16 flavors of hemagglutinin in the influenza world, and one of them is H1. And that hemagglutinin, if you stick it on any virus that grows, will be pathogenic and will do the kinds of things I mentioned. Moreover, there are 4 other hemagglutinins, hemagglutinin 6, 7, 10, and 15. They're out there in the bird world. They've never been in a human virus, but if you put them on the backbone of a chimeric virus and study them in animals, you'll find they do exactly the same thing. So, you know, one way to interpret that is that there are 16 hemagglutinins that could potentially get into a human virus. 3 of them have done it already. One of those 3 has caused a lot of damage, but there are 11 other hemagglutinins out there in nature that have not yet gotten into a human virus. And if they do, 4 of them are likely to do the same thing that the 1918 virus did. So, to get back to the subject at hand, how do we prevent these bad things from happening? Well, there's 3 categories of ways I think that are worth thinking about. One is to prevent influenza with vaccines. Martin has just given a great talk about that, and I only want to say that I wish I could be as optimistic as Martin and as Barney Graham, my NIH colleague who was cited by Martin. I think that, as I'll say in a minute, I think that our attempts to make universal influenza vaccines are far from being successful, or the potential of them is far from, it's not nearly as likely that we're going to have them, let me say it another way, as most of us hope. The second possible way is to prevent bacterial pneumonia with bacterial vaccines. The third possible way is to treat these infections, either the influenza or the bacterial infections, with drugs or with monoclonal antibodies. Now, this is a very geeky slide, which which defies understanding in 30 seconds of being up here. But these are United States data, and on the bottom is just mortality going from 1957 up to 2020. But on the top is these 4 different viruses that have been around, which are H2N2, H3N2, H1N1, which returned in 1977, and then the new 2009 H1N1, which is we call it PDM, which is a different flavor of H1N1. And among other things, we can see, if you look at this,
Can you change the slide, David? Can you change
on the step ladder? Tells us when we had to change the vaccine formulation, which is a reflection of the antigenic drift of the virus.
David, you need to change your slide. Maybe Olivia can help him.
Did that work?
No, you're still on how to prevent influenza bacterial copathogenesis slide, the 3 bullets.
Oh. Well, I can see it, but you cannot. Is that right? Oh my
We don't
gosh.
know. We don't know that.
What do I need to do to do what? Olivia, do you have any idea?
When you scroll
I can
or you press
well, I can
next, does
see them,
that
but you
change?
apparently can't.
Maybe it froze?
Let me move a few slides back and forward and see what we see.
Yeah, I think it froze. Maybe stop sharing and then reshare again.
Okay. Okay, can you see it now?
No.
Okay, it says you are sharing. What are you seeing? Because I see the whole slideshow.
On our end, it's just the black screen, and it says that you have started sharing the screen, but we don't see the PowerPoint.
Okay, let me try this all over again. Share screen.
Okay, now we can see the PowerPoint.
Okay.
You're on slide 33.
You stopped
Okay,
at
I
slide
can't
30.
make it move though, so let's see.
It froze at slide 30.
Yeah. What can you see? Can you see the slides now?
Yeah, slide 30.
Yep.
Can you
Yep, we can see you
31?
moving.
Yeah, good, good.
Okay, we back on track now. This is, I'm sorry, this, I don't know what happened, but this is what I was trying to show you, that if you look at these steps, this is H3N2 virus, which appeared in 1968, and you can see that we've had to change the vaccine formulation about every 2 years, which means that the virus is mutating at an extraordinary rate. And I will point out that 1968 virus started out as pretty wimpy, and it's gotten worse over time. So even by drift, these viruses can be getting worse. And therefore, and of course, this means that we've got to change the vaccine all the time. Are we going to be able to develop a universal vaccine that is able to circumvent this degree of antigenic drift? I don't know. Well, here's a bunch of vaccines. Can you see these now? It's working. This
Yes.
is just a bunch of vaccines that NIH is involved in development of. And I only show this to make the point that in none of these vaccines is a substantial part of the development looking at the ability of the vaccine to affect the freedom from secondary bacterial infection, which is to say, we're trying to make vaccines that prevent influenza, but we're not doing anything to prevent the fatalities caused by influenza if the vaccines don't work. And we've never had a influenza vaccine that was more than about 70, 80% efficacious in the most amenable age group. This image is a little bit complicated, but it basically makes the case that if we look over here on the left, if we look at the virus infection, virus vaccinated and virus unvaccinated people, vaccinating people is a good thing. You're not as likely if you get an influenza vaccination to have secondary bacterial infection. But over here on the right, if these secondary bacteria come in, the really bad ones, even being vaccinated isn't hugely protective. That is to say that the current vaccines are whatever efficacy they are in terms of preventing influenza, but if you do get influenza, they don't do a great job. They do a little bit of a job, but not a great job in preventing the complications. And part of the factor that relates to this is that to the extent that influenza vaccination prevents influenza and secondary bacterial complication, it works best only when there's an extraordinarily good match between the vaccine and the circulating strain at the time. I think this slide is a little fuzzy, but it makes the point circled here at the top that over recent decades, we've made progress in developing bacterial vaccines, including Haemophilus influenzae type B and the various pneumococcal vaccines, but we haven't made a lot of progress in some of the other ones. Here are some studies that show that the ability of these influenza vaccines to control bacterial infections is modest. And here's a few studies that are cited here. I don't know if they're going to be visible to everybody because it's kind of a small slide, but I think the point is that with the vaccines we have now, the ability to prevent these bacterial infections is limited. And there are two bad bugs we worry about, three bad bugs we worry about, but two of them I'm going to mention for which we're not very far down the road. One of them is streptococcal vaccine, streptococcal meaning group A strep or group A beta hemolytic strep pyogenes. These vaccines have been worked on since the 1920s. That's almost 100 years. And where are we? The answer is not very far down the road. I may have lost a slide here, but never mind. We'll go on. Staph aureus. Staph aureus has become the predominant fatal cause of secondary bacterial pneumonia in flu infections. And it's been very difficult to try to make a staph vaccine. A lot of people are working on it. The success is not very great. We do have drugs. We have Tamiflu, and we have Bloxavir, and we have Pramivir for intravenous use, and so on. But as I mentioned yesterday, these drugs have have an important but somewhat limited use. They're not the magic bullet that's going to cure influenza, and I don't know that we have a magic bullet down the road. It's interesting that in severe influenza caused by 1918 in animal models, much of the damage is caused by reactive oxygen species, ROS, which are oxyradicals that damage tissue. And there are drugs that in experimental animals can greatly limit that kind of damage, but these are not anywhere near human use. Monoclonal antibodies, I'm sorry, this is the vaccine slide. Part of the problem is when we make these vaccines and when we use a vaccine in an experimental animal, that raising antibodies and raising an immune response to these vaccines sometimes makes the problem worse. As for example, on the right, you see that when you immunize with Staph aureus, you get among other things, you get anti-toxic shock syndrome type 1 antibody and SEA antibody, and these are deleterious. So part of the problem of making bacterial vaccines is when you elicit an immune response, it sometimes makes the problem worse. These are monoclonal antibodies. These are data for monoclonal antibodies against bacteria, and same thing against viruses. And I think we've discussed this a little bit, and it's been a lot in the news about whether immune plasmas or monoclonal antibodies will work. But again, I don't see this as being a magic bullet. So where are we? We at NIH and many scientists around the world are trying to make universal influenza vaccines. And as I said, I'm much less optimistic than Martin and Barney Graham and others. I don't think we're anywhere near there. And one of the reasons is that I don't think we really understand the basis of protective immunity. We're doing human challenge studies now. We challenge volunteers with influenza. And of course, we can't challenge them with really deadly viruses. We challenge them with, virus of, chimera, with genetically engineered H1N1 and H3N2 viruses, to try to understand the correlates of protective immunity. And in a published paper a year or so ago, one of the things we found, and this really should be shocking to all of us, we have this idea that if you get infected with flu, you develop immunity, and that immunity lasts for a long time. If you get a vaccine, you develop immunity that may or may not be 100% protective, but it lasts for a while. What we did is we took a group of volunteers and we infected them with the H1N1 virus, and most of them developed an immune response, and most of them had symptoms, some of them moderately severe symptoms, and they developed immune response to the hemagglutinin, the neuraminidase, and the stem of the virus. And then we re-challenged them with the exact clonally identical virus an average of a year later, and most of them got sick all over again. Most of them got infected, most of them had an immune response to all of those components, most of them had symptoms. So is there such a thing as protective immunity even from a natural flu infection? I would argue that unless we understand the basis of protective immunity, and even if there is such a thing as protective immunity, we're not going to be able to make a good influenza vaccine. And I will note that for most respiratory viruses that do not cause viremia, some do, like measles causes viremia, rubella causes viremia, smallpox causes viremia. But if you take, the chickenpox does, but if you take those away and look at the respiratory viruses that don't cause viremia, flu, RSV, paraflu, we never get protective immunity, certainly not with RSV. The average person gets infected with RSV 50 times in a lifetime. Basically, these non-viremic viruses are not protected by systemic immunity, and we need to learn a lot about what we need to do in the future. So I'll end here, and I guess there's probably not much time for questions, but afterwards or through chat, I'll be happy to answer questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Excellent. I would encourage people, if you have a question, to send it by chat, and David is willing to address those. But in the interest of time, we have one more speaker, John Fitzsimmons from PAHO. We'll go to you, John. Thanks for joining us. And thanks again.
Thank you, David.
Sorry, David. Hi, John. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your help, Olivia, with the slides. And I have 10 minutes, and I'll share an update on behalf of the Pan American Health Organization on a revolving fund and our engagement over the years on demand and supply of seasonal influenza vaccines in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I want to thank the organizers for accommodating the late change in time for this presentation today. Next slide, please. And by way of introduction, for those who are unfamiliar with the revolving fund, we'll give a quick thumbnail review of that. We'll share regional demand and supply trends, both for the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere, and how we go about managing demand and supply in a constrained environment. Given the additional demands that we're receiving from countries, particularly during the pandemic period. Then we'll give a little information, uptake of influenza vaccine across other WHO regions, some of our lessons learned from the last pandemic, and a quick snapshot on the market landscape from our perspective. Next slide, please. This is the revolving fund. It was established by the PAHO member states back in 1977. It's been a very effective tool in support of the national immunization programs in the region, has contributed in many ways to many of the successes of the region, eradicating polio, eliminating measles, introducing new vaccines such as influenza vaccine to the region. There's a quick snapshot on the number of vaccines that are being provided. The 42 countries that are participating in the revolving fund, the numbers of people that are being immunized annually through provision of vaccine to national immunization programs, and the amounts procured in dollar terms last year of almost $770 million. The fund continues to grow year upon year, and it also has a working capital fund, which is used by countries to purchase in advance their vaccines. And most importantly, it's part of a larger technical cooperation package that leads to the achievements that I've mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. This is a quick overview on trends in Northern Hemisphere for influenza from 2017 to 2021. You can see in the blue bars, the continuing increase in demand over the past few years. We're at a level of about 6.6 million doses for the Northern Hemisphere. Next year, we expect an uptick to about 8.5 million doses. In the orange bars, you see the procured doses. There was a bit of a spike in 2018, similar numbers this year. We're in the process of finalizing orders this month and next month. One of the pending countries to receive vaccine this year is Ecuador, on account of some of its financial challenges currently. The two countries that are not reflected in the numbers here are Mexico and Venezuela, and their respective demand numbers are shown in the table below. Next slide, please. For the Southern Hemisphere, the demand information is also presented in the blue bars, along with the procured values in the orange bars. The level of demand is on the order of 20+ million doses annually. You can see a projected increase for the new season upcoming during the first quarter of next year of over 25 million doses. So we've seen steady increase in that way. Also, we see change depending on the epidemiological picture in the vaccines being applied from one hemisphere to the next. And this occurred most recently last year and this year. And countries like Chile, Colombia, and Uruguay have been requesting additional doses. Next slide, please. In terms of perspective on distribution by WHO region through 2015, this gives you a perspective of the AMRO region in blue, or PAHO, compared with some of the other WHO regions. Euro and WIPRO are the other important regions that have really begun to develop their immunization programs as well for influenza, and making influenza vaccine available to their national immunization programs. So it's a quick snapshot of what's happening globally.
John, can I ask you a quick question? Does that
Sure.
include US and Canada data for PAHO?
It does not. In the next slide, please. Go for the next click. So this is an overview of differential access to pandemic influenza vaccine in the region from the previous pandemic. So in the purple bar, if you could just back up a little bit, Olivia, we'll just stick with this one first. This purple represents North America, US and Canada, population of about 348 million, 49 million people. And in the hatched section of the bar, this is approximately 50% of the population that had access to influenza pandemic influenza vaccine during the period October to February of 2019. If you could click forward, Olivia. Now we're looking at those countries, Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, who may have access to national production within their environments, a population of 340 million, and that had sufficient vaccine to cover about 44% of their population. Go ahead, Olivia, with the next slide. Here we have the revolving fund, and our demand at the time was intended to cover about 213 million population, and we were able to receive during the period 2009 to 2010 about 5% of our total requirements at the time. And then the last click are those that were by donation, targeting about 78 million, of which 12% of vaccine was made available at the time. So one of the lessons for us as a region was how to be more equitable in our distribution of vaccine, how to take the inequalities that we experienced in the last pandemic and turn that on its head in terms of the coronavirus pandemic that we're confronting this year and next year. And the next slide. Just to summarize, here bottom left, more than 236 million doses were applied in the region.
The slide needs to be advanced.
Yeah. Okay. And so this is a quick snapshot on production capabilities across the globe through 2019 in the region. Mexico, Nicaragua, Brazil, of course, and Argentina are all sources of production in the region. The most recent being in Nicaragua for its national population, and there's interest there in exporting to neighboring countries. In Central America, we're in touch with that lab, as well as with the laboratory in Brazil. These two may be two new entrants to the revolving fund in the coming year. Next slide, please. And then final slide. One more slide, please, Olivia. Thanks. This, just to leave you with, back to my point on lessons learned from the prior pandemic, our approach with the new pandemic is to be engaged with the COVAX facility together with other international partners in an attempt to achieve a more equitable allocation of the newer COVID-19 vaccines when they become available. And so we just leave in the slide set a quick overview of that in the case there is interest. And last slide. Thank you very much.
John, excellent. In a short period of time, you covered a lot of ground with the revolving fund and the key challenge to provide equitable access, not only to flu vaccines and others, but the upcoming challenge with if and when a COVID vaccine becomes available. I hope you're available to stay with the group in the closed session, which precedes this at 11:15. We're now at 11:14. I open the floor for a couple minutes of quick questions. Again, John will, as with the other speakers, will ask you to field questions by either email or chat as they come in. Olivia is helping us with that.
There are a few questions in the chat right now. Do you want me to read those, or how do you want to address that, John?
Let's go ahead, because we do have a couple minutes and then we will have to close the meeting. Go ahead. Thanks, Olivia.
So Cecilia says, is there a pandemic preparedness strategy for PAHO?
You want me to take that, John?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So, and that's been ongoing. Dr. Alba Maria Ropero, who's with us, will probably speak more to that. We've been actively engaged with our colleagues at WHO and also with member states here in the region on that in terms of adapting that to our current situation here in the region. There's a whole bunch of work going on preparing countries for readiness to receive the eventual COVID-19 vaccines when they are determined safe and efficacious. Over.
John, if I may. Yeah.
Please.
Thank you. Andrea is also connected. PAHO has been working with countries since 2009, before 2009 pandemic, in the planning process, and they have been working and they have updated those plans. Those were adapted to the COVID vaccine situation. That has been a very long process, and PAHO has been very closely working with countries on that. And there is a question regarding if PAHO is planning to introduce quadrivalent vaccine. We don't have a preferential recommendation for vaccines so far, but some countries have already introduced the vaccine. If the country requests the vaccine based on the national epidemiology and national cost-effectiveness studies, they can request the vaccine. We have more than 6 countries using quadrivalent vaccines so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ropero. Another quick question, Olivia, for John?
I think that is all, but I will go back through, and if there are any coming through later on, I will field those to you, John.
John, thanks again. We wish you the best of luck in tackling these challenges to make these vaccines accessible and reduce the inequities that exist. Please stay with us and join the next session in the closed group. I'll ask Olivia, anything else before we close?
That's all. Thank you guys for participating, and thank you to the amazing speakers.
Ditto. It was a great session. We all appreciate the work that went in. Martin, David, John, thanks again. See everybody tomorrow. We'll talk more about strategies. Dr. Ropero, who's there, will also be involved in giving PAHO's perspective and the strategies, as well as other speakers. So we're looking forward to that. Dr. Steve Berman will be the director of the Center for Global Health, will be the moderator. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.